My phone rang at 2:13 in the morning, and I knew before I even looked at the screen that something was wrong, because nobody calls a 61-year-old man at that hour with good news. I fumbled for it on the nightstand, knocked over the glass of water I always kept there, and saw my granddaughter's name lighting up the dark. Lily, 8 years old. She wasn't supposed to have unsupervised access to a phone at that hour, wasn't supposed to be awake at all, and the fact that she was calling me from wherever she was told me everything I needed to know before she said a single word. Grandpa? Her voice was a whisper, thin and shaking, the kind of whisper a child uses when she's trying not to be heard by someone in the next room. Lily, honey, I'm here. What's wrong? Dad says. A pause, a swallow. Dad says you can never come back. He said I'm not allowed to talk to you anymore. He said if I call you again, he's going to. And then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, coming up behind her voice, and Lily's breath caught in her throat in a way that turned my blood to ice water. Lily, who are you talking to? Derek's voice, flat and cold. The voice he used when he wanted to sound calm, and instead sounded like something with all the warmth surgically removed. There was a scuffling sound, the phone changing hands or being knocked from one, and then the line went dead. I called back 4 times. Straight to voicemail every time, a woman's automated voice telling me the person I was trying to reach was unavailable. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, with my heart slamming against my ribs like it was trying to break out, and I thought about driving the 40 minutes to their house right then, pounding on the door, demanding to see my granddaughter with my own eyes. I didn't do it, not because I wasn't scared enough, but because I was scared in a specific way. The way you get scared when you've spent 31 years learning exactly how much damage a calm, controlled, dangerous man can do to the people who love him, and how patiently he can do it. If you're just finding this channel, welcome. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened after that phone call, from the beginning, so you understand every piece of it. And I promise you this, by the end of this story, the man who took my granddaughter's voice away from her in the middle of the night is going to lose everything he built his life on top of. Stay with me. My name is Walter Hendricks. Everyone who's ever mattered to me calls me Walt. For 31 years, before I retired, I worked as a special investigator for a mid-sized insurance company out of Columbus, Ohio. The last 19 of those years specializing in fraud, the kind of fraud that hides inside spreadsheets and shell companies, and forged signatures, the kind that looks, on the surface, like nothing at all is wrong. I spent my career learning how to read a paper trail the way other men read a room. I learned that liars are almost never caught by a single dramatic mistake. They're caught by 1,000 small inconsistencies that nobody bothers to add up, because most people don't have the patience to add them up. I had the patience. It's the one talent I've ever had that I'm genuinely proud of. I raised my daughter Melissa alone from the time she was 6, after her mother, my wife Diane, died of a brain aneurysm on a Tuesday afternoon while she was folding laundry. One second she was there, the next she was on the kitchen floor, and I was 34 years old with a 6-year-old daughter and a mortgage and a job that required me to travel 3 weeks out of every month. I turned down every promotion that would have taken me further from home. I worked the overnight shift auditing claims files so I could be at every school pickup, every dance recital, every parent-teacher conference. I coached her softball team for 6 years, even though I'd never played softball in my life. Learned the rules out of a library book the same week she made the roster. I missed exactly one of her birthdays, when she was 11, because I was in a hospital myself with pneumonia, and I have never forgiven myself for that one. Not fully. Not even now. I put $900 a month into a college fund starting the year she turned 2, driving a car with 240,000 miles on it, so that fund never had to be touched for anything else. When Diane died, her modest life insurance policy and the small trust her own mother had left behind went untouched, every penny of it, into an account that was meant for Melissa and, eventually, for her children. I never spent a dollar of it on myself. Not once. I'm telling you all of this not to make myself sound like some kind of saint, because I wasn't one, and I want to be honest with you about that too. I was not always a good listener. When Melissa was in her 20s and dating a string of men I didn't approve of, I let her know it, loudly and often, in ways that pushed her away from me instead of toward better choices. There was a stretch of almost 2 years in her mid-20s when she barely spoke to me, and it was almost entirely my fault, because I couldn't separate loving my daughter from trying to control who she loved. I've thought about that a lot since all of this happened. I've wondered if that old habit of mine, that need to weigh in, to warn, to protect a little too hard, is part of what made her so determined not to listen to me when I finally had something real to warn her about. She met Derek Voss when she was 29. He was 34, already running his own commercial real estate development firm, the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately became the center of gravity in it, charming in that smooth, rehearsed way that some men have, the kind of charm that works like a spotlight, intense and flattering when it's pointed at you, and then you notice, if you're paying attention, how it swings away just as fast when someone else walks in who matters more to him. I didn't like him from the first dinner. I told myself it was because no father likes the man who's about to take his daughter, and for a long time I believed that was all it was. I kept my mouth shut about Derek for years, specifically because of what had happened with the men before him, because I'd learned painfully that my disapproval only drove Melissa closer to the men I disapproved of. That silence is the thing I regret most in this entire story. More than anything Derek ever did, I regret every year I sat on what my gut was telling me because I was afraid of losing my daughter a second time. They married when Melissa was 31. Lily came 2 years later. And somewhere in that stretch of years, so gradually that I couldn't point to a single day it happened, my daughter started disappearing. It wasn't dramatic. There were no bruises I ever saw, no shouting matches I ever witnessed. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more effective. Melissa had been a marketing director at a mid-sized firm downtown, sharp and independent, the kind of woman who used to call me every Sunday just to argue with me about politics for 45 minutes because she liked the sparring. After Lily was born, Derek suggested, gently, reasonably, the way he suggested everything, that it made more sense for Melissa to stay home, at least for a while, given how demanding his firm's expansion was becoming and how much he needed her support at home. She agreed. It made sense, on paper. Except the while never ended. Except the Sunday calls got shorter, then less frequent, then stopped almost entirely. Except every time I saw her, she deferred to him in small ways I started, slowly, to catalog without even meaning to. The way she'd glance at him before answering a simple question about her own schedule. The way she stopped making plans that didn't run through his calendar first. The way her bank cards, when I happened to see her use one at a restaurant once, were all under accounts with his name listed first. I want to be precise about something because precision has been the backbone of my entire working life, and I'm not going to abandon it now just because this story is personal. I did not know, in those years, that anything criminal was happening. I suspected control. I suspected a marriage that had quietly become something closer to a management structure than a partnership. I did not suspect, not for 1 second, the specific thing I would eventually find. If I had, I promise you, I would have acted years sooner, and I have to live with the fact that I didn't see it in time to stop it before it went as far as it went. The isolation from me specifically began about 18 months, that 2-13 phone call. It started with small things. Derek suggesting that my visits once weekly might be a lot for Lily's schedule of activities, and could we move to every other week? Then every other week becoming once a month, with reasons that always sounded, individually, completely legitimate. A family trip, a busy season at the firm, Lily's soccer schedule. I didn't fight it hard enough, because each individual excuse was reasonable. And it's only when I look back at 18 months of them stacked together that the pattern becomes impossible to miss. That's the thing about a slow squeeze. Each turn of the screw feels small enough to tolerate. It's only the totality that reveals the design. 3 months before the phone call, I drove out unannounced on a Saturday, something I almost never did, because I'd had a bad feeling all week that I couldn't name. Melissa answered the door looking thin in a way she hadn't been thin before, and tired in a way that went past ordinary parental exhaustion. Derek was pleasant. He always was, right up until the moment he wasn't. He made me coffee, asked about my knee, which had been bothering me, told a funny story about a client. And the entire time, I watched Melissa sit very still at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her, saying almost nothing, and I watched her eyes flick toward him before she spoke. Every single time, the way you check a stove burner before you set your hand down near it. I asked her, when Derek stepped out to take a work call, if everything was all right. She said yes. She said it fast, the way people say things when the truth is a much longer and more complicated answer than they're prepared to give in the 30 seconds they have before someone comes back into the room. I didn't push. I've asked myself 100 times since then why I didn't push, why I let "yes, Dad, I'm fine" be the end of the conversation when every instinct built over 3 decades of catching liars for a living was screaming at me that something underneath that word was rotten. The honest answer is that I was afraid. I was afraid that if I pushed too hard, she would pull away from me completely, the way she had in her 20s, and I would lose whatever thread still connected me to her and to Lily. So I told myself I was respecting her boundaries. I told myself that was love. I know now that it was, at least in part, cowardice wearing love's clothing, and that is a distinction I intend to spend the rest of my life being honest with myself about. That was the last time I saw either of them in person before the phone call, in the 2 weeks after Lily's whispered warning cut off in the middle of the night. I did not sleep more than 4 hours in any given stretch. I called Melissa's cell repeatedly, and it went to voicemail every single time. I called the house line, which I still had memorized from years of calling to say goodnight to Lily, and it had been disconnected. Not just unanswered. Disconnected. A fast 3-tone signal and a recorded voice telling me the number was no longer in service. I drove out to the house on a Tuesday afternoon, and there was a car in the driveway I didn't recognize, a black SUV, and when I knocked, nobody answered, though I was almost certain I saw a curtain move in an upstairs window. I stood on that porch for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes, because I looked at my watch 3 separate times, unable to make myself leave, unable to make myself do anything, but stand there like a man locked out of his own life. I want to tell you what I felt standing on that porch, because I think it matters to understanding everything that came after. I did not feel rage yet. Rage would come later, and when it came in a form colder and more useful than anything I'd felt in years. What I felt on that porch was something closer to grief, mixed with a very specific, very old fear, the fear of a man who has spent his entire career learning to recognize the shape of a lie, standing outside a house where he suspects, with a certainty he cannot yet prove, that someone he loves is being lied to on an industrial scale, and being powerless in that exact moment to do a single thing about it. That powerlessness lasted exactly 4 more days, because on the 5th day, a Saturday, I got a call from a man named Gerald Okafor, my late wife's cousin's husband, a semi-retired attorney who did probate and estate work out of a small practice 2 towns over, and who had, for reasons I didn't understand yet, been trying to reach Melissa for 6 weeks about a matter connected to Diane's mother's original trust, the same trust I had folded, untouched, into the account meant for Melissa and eventually for Lily. Gerald told me something on that call that made the floor of my stomach drop out entirely, something involving a filing, a signature, and an amendment to a trust document that I knew for an absolute fact my late wife had set up specifically so that no single person, not me, not Melissa's future husband, nobody, could ever unilaterally touch it. I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad, the same kind of pad I'd used for 31 years to break down insurance fraud cases, one small inconsistency at a time, and I wrote a single line at the top of the first page, Derek Voss. Start from the beginning. Assume nothing. It was 6:40 in the evening. I did not get up from that table again until almost 2 in the morning, and by the time I did, I had the outline of the first 11 questions I intended to answer, and a promise to myself that within 90 days I would have enough documented, dated, corroborated proof to walk into a courtroom, or a police station, or wherever the truth needed to go, and take my daughter and my granddaughter back for good. I did not know yet exactly what I would find. I did not know how deep it went, or how much of my daughter's silence had been fear, and how much had been something else entirely, something I would only understand much later. But I knew how to find out. Finding the truth hidden inside a mountain of ordinary-looking paperwork was the one thing in this world I had spent my entire working life learning to do better than almost anyone. Derek Voss had made one mistake that night. The same mistake every liar I ever caught in 31 years eventually made. He had underestimated exactly who he was dealing with. He thought he was silencing a tired old man's phone call. What he had actually done was wake up the most patient investigator he was ever going to meet. The story continued from where I left off, Walt building his case against Derek. I spent the first week after that night at my kitchen table, treating my own family like the biggest fraud case of my career, because that's exactly what my training told me it was. Rule 1. The rule I drilled into every junior investigator I ever trained. Don't chase the story you're afraid of. Chase the paper. The paper doesn't have feelings. The paper doesn't lie to protect itself, not the way people do. People lie constantly, reflexively, sometimes without even knowing they're doing it. Documents, bank records, filing dates, notarization stamps, those things are stubborn. They sit there in black and white, waiting for someone patient enough to read them correctly. Gerald Okafor was the one who cracked the first door open, though he didn't know at the time how far the hallway behind it went. He explained it to me slowly, the way a good lawyer explains things to a client who isn't a lawyer, even though I'd spent 3 decades reading legal filings for a living and understood most of it faster than he expected. Diane's mother, my mother-in-law, had set up an irrevocable trust back in 1998, 5 years before she passed, specifically naming Melissa as the sole beneficiary once she turned 35, with me as trustee until that date. The trust had a spendthrift clause, the kind designed to protect a beneficiary from creditors, from bad decisions, and, though nobody ever says this part out loud when they draft these things, from a future spouse who might someday try to get his hands on it. It was a good document. Diane's mother had been a sharp, suspicious woman who trusted almost no one, and she'd built that trust like a bank vault. 6 weeks before Lily's call, a filing had gone through the county recorder's office. An amendment. Not to the original trust, that document really was locked tight, but to a secondary account, a smaller, supplementary fund Melissa's grandmother had set up separately, meant to cover Lily's future education, roughly $210,000, sitting in a joint custodial arrangement that had, until 6 weeks earlier, required both my signature and Melissa's to move any funds out for anything beyond direct tuition payments. The amendment removed me as a co-signer entirely. It replaced me with Derek. The signature on that amendment was supposed to be Melissa's. Gerald had noticed something off about it purely by accident, because he'd handled 2 other documents for Melissa years earlier, and the notary stamp on this new filing belonged to a notary public, whose license, according to the state registry I checked myself 2 days later, had been suspended 11 months prior for reasons the registry didn't specify. A suspended notary, attesting to a signature on a document that moved control of my granddaughter's education fund into the sole hands of her father. I sat with that fact for a long time before I did anything else because I needed to be sure I wasn't seeing what I wanted to see. That's the second rule I lived by for 31 years. Confirmation bias kills more investigations than bad evidence does. So instead of confronting anyone, instead of calling Melissa and screaming into the phone the way every instinct in my chest wanted me to, I opened a blank spreadsheet, the same way I'd opened 1,000 blank spreadsheets before, and I started a timeline. Column 1, date. Column 2, event. Column 3, source. Column 4, whether it was independently verifiable or just something I remembered or suspected. I would not let myself write a single conclusion into that spreadsheet that didn't have at least 2 independent points of evidence behind it. If I broke that rule even once, the whole case would be worth nothing to a court, and worse, it would be worth nothing to me because I needed, more than I needed almost anything else in my life at that point, to be right for the right reasons. Gerald pulled the notary's full case file from the state board, which took another 9 days, and one very awkward lunch where I bought him a very expensive steak in exchange for expediting some calls he technically didn't owe me. What came back confirmed something I'd already begun to suspect from a different direction entirely. The suspended notary, a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, had lost her commission after a formal complaint filed by an elderly client's family, alleging she had notarized a power of attorney document for a client who was, according to two independent medical assessments filed with the complaint, not in a state of mind at the time to understand what she was signing. The complaint named the person who had brought Miss Chandrasekaran to that client's bedside. It was a name I recognized instantly because it belonged to a business associate of Derek's, a man named Robert Kessler, who ran what his own website described as a wealth transition consultancy. Three words that, in 31 years of reading exactly this kind of language, had taught me to mean one thing. He specialized in moving money out of the hands of people who were too old, too sick, or too controlled to notice it leaving. I want to pause here and tell you something honestly, because this story only means anything if I tell it to you straight. When I found Robert Kessler's name sitting inside that complaint file, connected by a single thin thread to the man who had married my daughter, I did not feel triumphant. I felt sick, because up until that exact moment, some small stubborn part of me had still been hoping I was wrong, hoping that what I'd find, at the bottom of all this digging, was a controlling husband and a strained marriage and nothing more criminal than a man who liked having too much power over his wife's decisions. That's a problem. That's a real problem, and I don't want to minimize it as if it isn't. But it isn't the kind of problem you can put a man in prison for. What I found instead told me this wasn't just about control. This was about money, moved with intention, using tools, a compromised notary, a wealth transition specialist with a documented history of exploiting vulnerable signers that suggested a level of premeditation I hadn't let myself imagine. I called Gerald that night and asked him one question. If Melissa's signature on that trust amendment wasn't really her signature, or wasn't given with a clear understanding of what she was signing, what would that mean legally? He was quiet for a second. Then he said, carefully, the way lawyers talk when they don't want to promise something they can't deliver, depending on what you can prove, Walt, that could be forgery, or it could be financial exploitation, or, in the worst version of this, it could be both, layered together with something like coercive control, which some states are only just now starting to write actual statutes for. But Walt, I need you to hear me. You cannot go pull on this thread alone. If this is what it looks like, you need law enforcement, and you need it soon, because men who do this once rarely stop at once. He was more right than either of us understood yet. 2 days after that phone call with Gerald, I did something I'm not proud of, though I've made my peace with it since. I drove to Lily's elementary school and sat in my truck across the street during afternoon pickup, not to approach her. I want to be completely clear about that. I never once tried to contact her directly after that night, because I understood exactly how dangerous that could be for both of us if Derek found out. But simply to see her. To see with my own eyes that she was alive, that she was walking, that she was, from a distance of 60 yards, apparently unharmed. I watched a woman I didn't recognize, young, maybe a nanny or a babysitter, walk her to a car that wasn't Melissa's and wasn't Derek's SUV. Lily was quiet. She used to run to the car. I remembered that from the handful of pickups I'd done for her over the years, the way she used to sprint the last 20 feet with her backpack bouncing against her spine, laughing at nothing in particular the way happy 8-year-olds do. She didn't run that day. She walked with her head down and got into the car and didn't look up once. I drove home, and I did not sleep that night either. But for the first time since the phone call, the thing keeping me awake wasn't fear. It was resolve, cold and total, settling into my chest like something with weight and shape to it. I had spent 31 years finding the truth buried inside numbers for an insurance company that mostly just wanted to avoid paying out claims. I decided, sitting in my dark kitchen at 4 a.m. with that spreadsheet open in front of me, that I was going to spend whatever time I had left doing things work for the two people who mattered more to me than anyone alive. The next morning, I called an old colleague of mine, a woman named Renata Ibarra who had spent 22 years as a financial crimes detective before retiring to consulting work. Someone I'd worked 3 separate joint cases with back when insurance fraud and outright financial exploitation overlapped enough to need both our departments in the same room. I told her everything. The phone call at 2:13 in the morning, Lily's whisper, the disconnected house line, the suspended notary, Robert Kessler's name sitting inside somebody else's exploitation complaint. Renata listened without interrupting for almost 11 minutes, which for Renata, who I'd never once known to let a silence sit that long, told me she understood exactly how serious this was before I'd even finished talking. Walt, she said finally, I'm going to help you build this properly, start to finish. Because if you go at this alone and sloppy, a good defense attorney tears it apart in about 4 minutes, and worse, you tip him off before we've got enough lockdown to move fast. But I need you to promise me something. The second we have enough for a warrant, you step back and let people with badges walk through that door. Not you. You've got too much to lose personally to be the one standing on that porch when it happens. I promised her. I want you to remember that I promised her, because it matters for what comes later in this story. Over the following 3 weeks, Renata and I built the file the right way, methodically. The way you build something meant to survive a courtroom instead of just satisfying your own anger. We pulled property records showing that 6 months before that trust amendment, Derek's development firm had quietly taken out a bridge loan of $1.4 million against 2 stalled commercial properties, a loan that was, according to a source Renata still had inside the county clerk's office, 41 days from a default notice being filed. We pulled banking subpoena requests, which Renata had the connections to expedite in ways I never could have alone, and those requests eventually turned up something that made even Renata go quiet on the phone for the second time in 3 weeks. In the 11 months before that trust amendment, 3 other trust or estate accounts connected to elderly or vulnerable relatives of Derek's business associates had been restructured using paperwork bearing signatures notarized by the same suspended notary, Priya Chandrasekaran, and in every single one of those cases, a portion of the redirected funds had eventually flowed through 2 shell companies registered in Delaware into accounts controlled by Derek Voss's development firm. This wasn't a controlling husband anymore. This was a pattern. My granddaughter's education fund hadn't been an isolated act of one desperate man trying to save his business. It was the 4th documented instance of a scheme that had been running for almost a year, using vulnerable people and a corrupted notary to quietly bleed money into a failing real estate empire that was, according to every filing we could find, 41 days from collapsing when they came for Lily's money. And somewhere inside that house, cut off from her phone, cut off from her father, living with a man capable of this, was my daughter. I still didn't know, at that point, exactly how much Melissa knew, how much she'd signed willingly, and how much had been done to her, rather than by her. That question, whether my daughter was a victim in this, or, in some smaller, more complicated way complicit, was the one that kept me awake longer than any other, and it was the one I would not get a true answer to until the night everything finally came apart. I'll continue the story with part 3. The night everything came apart started with a call I wasn't expecting, 17 days after Renata and I had finished building the file. It was a Thursday, just past 9 in the evening, and the number on my screen wasn't one I recognized. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. Dad? Melissa's voice, so quiet I had to press the phone hard against my ear to be sure it was really her. Dad, it's me. I don't have much time. I'm using a phone I bought at a drugstore. Please don't say anything loud, just listen. I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I'm listening, sweetheart. I'm right here. What came out of her over the next 9 minutes was the thing I had been afraid of and hoping for in equal measure since the night Lily called me. Melissa told me, in a voice that kept breaking and reforming itself, that she had signed a stack of documents 8 months earlier during a week when she'd been recovering from a minor surgery and taking, on Derek's insistence, a combination of prescribed pain medication and something else he'd told her was just to help her sleep through the recovery. She said she remembered signing things. She said she didn't remember reading them, didn't remember a notary being present in any moment she could clearly picture, and that when she'd asked Derek about it weeks later, foggy and uncertain, he had told her, calmly, that she was imagining things, that she'd asked him the same question 3 times already, and he'd already explained it to her twice. She said that was the moment, though it took her months to admit it fully to herself, that she started to understand something had been done to her, rather than with her. She said the isolation from me hadn't been Derek's idea presented as his idea. It had been presented to her as something I had asked for. A story about me needing space, about me being overwhelmed since my knee surgery, a story she now suspected, with rising horror in her own voice as she said it out loud to me for the first time, was never true at all. He's been lying to both of us, she said, for months, maybe longer. Dad, I found paperwork last week, by accident, in a box in the garage he doesn't know I went into. I don't understand half of it, but I understand the number, and the number is enormous, and I think he spent Lily's fund. I think he spent all of it. I told her everything then. Renata, the suspended notary, Robert Kessler, the pattern of 4 accounts, not one. The bridge loan 41 days from default. I told her as gently and as clearly as 31 years of delivering hard truths to frightened people had taught me how to do, because I needed her to hear all of it at once, without me softening a single piece of it into something less true than it was. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, I need to get Lily out of this house, tonight. I don't think I can wait for lawyers and warrants. Dad, he's been different this week, angrier. I think the loan is about to fail, and I think he knows it. And I don't know what a man like that does when everything he's built starts collapsing at once. I called Renata the second Melissa's line went dead. Renata called 2 detectives she still trusted from her old unit. Within 40 minutes there was a plan in motion that I was, per my promise, not supposed to be any closer to than the far end of a phone line. I broke that promise within the hour, and I've never regretted it, though I understand exactly why Renata was furious with me afterward. I drove to the house. I told myself I would sit in my truck down the block, out of sight, simply to be close in case Melissa needed somewhere safe to run to before the police arrived. What I found when I got there, parked half a block down with my lights off, was Melissa's sedan already backed halfway out of the garage, dome light on inside the car, and Derek standing in the open garage doorway in a bathrobe, screaming something I couldn't make out at that distance, waving a phone in one hand. I got out of the truck. I know exactly what I promised Renata, and I want to be honest with you and say that in that moment, watching a man scream at my daughter while she tried to get my granddaughter into a car in the dark, every promise I'd made about staying out of it evaporated completely. By the time I reached the end of the driveway, Derek had crossed the garage and grabbed the driver's side door of Melissa's car before she could pull it shut, and I heard Lily screaming from the back seat, a high, raw sound that I will hear in my sleep for the rest of my life. I didn't think. I put myself between Derek and that open car door, 61 years old with a bad knee against a man 11 years younger than me, and I told him, in a voice I didn't entirely recognize as my own, that he was going to step back right now, and that the police were already on their way, and that everything he'd done, Kessler, Chandrasekaran, the 4 accounts, the loan, all of it, was already documented, dated, and sitting in the hands of people who were about to make sure he never touched another dollar that wasn't his for the rest of his life. I watched something happen to Derek Voss's face in that moment that I have thought about many times since. It wasn't rage, not primarily. It was the specific, particular collapse of a man who has spent years believing himself untouchable, watching in real time as the floor he'd built that belief on turned out to be exactly as hollow as everything else he'd constructed. He didn't lunge at me. He didn't need to. 2 patrol cars turned onto the street 90 seconds later, lights cutting silently through the dark the way they do when officers don't want to escalate a scene before they've assessed it, and Derek Voss stood very still in his driveway in a bathrobe, while Melissa held Lily against her chest in the back seat of a car with the door finally shut and locked, both of them shaking, both of them for the first time in longer than either of them could probably remember, actually safe. The arrest came 6 weeks later, once Renata's old unit had finished cross-referencing every account, every notarized signature, every dollar that had moved from 4 separate vulnerable people into Derek Voss's failing development firm. He was charged with forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable person, and conspiracy alongside Robert Kessler and, separately, Priya Chandrasekaran, whose suspended notary commission turned out to be the single loose thread that had unraveled all of it. The trust amendment was voided in probate court within 4 months. Every dollar that could be traced and clawed back from the shell companies was, and while it wasn't the full amount, Gerald Okafor fought for 18 months afterward, largely for free, to recover as much of Lily's education fund as the law allowed. Melissa filed for divorce 3 weeks after that night in the driveway. She moved in with me for the better part of a year, while she rebuilt something like a stable life. And in that year, I got to watch my granddaughter learn to run again, fast, laughing at nothing, 20 feet across a driveway that finally, after everything, belonged entirely to people who loved her. I think about that 2:13 a.m. phone call almost every day, still. I think about a frightened 8-year-old whispering into a phone she wasn't supposed to have, brave enough in that single, terrified moment to try to warn me, even though she had no idea what warning me would eventually set in motion. She saved her mother's life in a very real sense, and I've told her that in age-appropriate words more than once, because I never want her to grow up not understanding what her courage that night actually did. People sometimes ask me if I regret how long it took me to see what was happening to my own daughter, sitting right in front of me for years. I do regret it. I regret every dinner where I told myself I was respecting her boundaries when really I was just afraid of losing her again. But I've made my peace with one thing, and it's the thing I want to leave you with tonight. It is never too late to start paying attention. It is never too late to pick up a legal pad and write, "Assume nothing" at the top of the page, and start looking, honestly and patiently, for the truth underneath the story you've been told. Derek Voss believed for a long time that he was dealing with a tired old man who wouldn't notice, wouldn't fight, wouldn't have the tools to unravel what he'd built. He was wrong about all three. And every single person out there right now who is being slowly, quietly isolated from the people who love them. I hope this story tells you that it is possible to fight your way back. It just takes someone patient enough to start asking the right questions.